So good evening, and it's a great pleasure to be joining this evening's group from the University of Edinburgh, where for once the temperature recently has been warmer than I think the temperature in Oxford. Oxford, I saw on the weather forecast one night, was down to -10, and somewhere in Scotland, not too far away from Edinburgh, was +16, which is absolutely unheard of. So interesting times in which we live. But welcome to this session of the Oxford Interfaith Forum's Shared Literatures in Interfaith Context Reading Group, and a special welcome to our speaker for this evening, Professor Laurent Mignon. Professor Mignon is Professor of Turkish Literature in the University of Oxford, based in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, which I think is still referred to by some of us as the Oriental Institute. And he's also a fellow in Turkish at the Middle East Center of St. Anthony's College. He teaches courses on Turkish language and literature in both the Ottoman and Republican periods, the transition between which, of course, is being marked this year. And he's previously taught these subjects in a number of other institutions, including Bilkent University in Ankara, where he was based between 2002 and 2011. His research interests focus on the minor literatures of the Ottoman and Republican period, and in particular on Jewish literature. But this evening, he's going to be focusing on Christian literature under the title From the People of the Book to the Books of the People, Christian Literature and the 19th Century Ottoman Turkish Literary World. Professor Mignon, you're very welcome, and over to you. The idea is that Professor Mignon will speak for about 40 minutes so that we then have a quarter of an hour or so for questions and discussion. Thank you, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Goddard, for this very kind introduction. Now, when it comes to the name of the faculty, I must admit that I have slightly ambivalent feelings regarding its new name, so I like to call it the faculty formerly known as Oriental Studies, which I suppose is something we can all live with. I think I should start immediately. I will try to share my screen. It's always something adventurous, so let's see if it works. So I think it should have worked. I'm being told that participants can now see my application. I hope they see the right thing. So in his memoirs entitled Geschichte eines Mohammedaners, der Christ wurde, so the story of a Muslim who became a Christian, published in 1930, the Protestant Christian missionary Johannes Avetaranian dwells extensively on his endeavors as a translator, publisher, and distributor of Christian literature among Turcophone peoples. Both Christian and Muslim, from Kashgar in southern Xinjiang to Varna in today's Bulgaria. Born Muhammed Shukru, originally from Erzurum in northeastern Turkey, Avetaranian did not only translate the Gospels and Christian proselytic literature into Turkish, or often transcribe this literature from Armeno-Turkish, which is Turkish in the Armenian alphabet, to Ottoman Turkish, which is Turkish in the Ottoman variant of the Perso-Arabic alphabet. But he also translated John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a favorite of Protestant missionaries, but also a great literary text. So this is what Richard Schäfer, who edited Avetaranian's memoirs, tells his readers, and you have the German on top of my slide. I'll translate it into English for you. Avetaranian translates John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress into Turkish so that Muslims do not have to accept the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, or the French novels as products of Christian literature. Now, the other pictures you see on my slide, on the one hand, we have a drawing actually of Avetaranian apparently translating the Gospels into what it says Kashgarish. I suppose it must be Uyghur Turkish, and I must say he looks so much better than I do at my desk. And the other is not an Armeno-Turkish translation of the Pilgrim's Progress. I didn't have a good picture. It's a Greco-Turkish translation of the Pilgrim's Progress, Hristiyan Yolculuğu. So Turkish in the Greek script. It's also known as Karamanlı. So to go back to Richard Schaeffer's remark, it is really interesting because it's true that intellectual historians of the late Ottoman Empire have tended to emphasize the impact of Western rationalist and materialist thought and the conflict with Islamic conservative worldviews. There is no denying that by the time that the Turkish convert was exercising his ministry, Emile Zola, the naturalist novelist, and Ludwig Büchner, the exponent of scientific materialism, were influential among part of the progressive intelligentsia in Ottoman Turkey. Yet, this is not the whole story. Indeed, some of the earliest Western literary texts that were translated into Turkish, such as Fénelon's Les Aventures de Télémaque, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, or the Abbé Prévost's Manon Lescaut with its strong Jansenist polemics, these were deeply entrenched, these were texts that were deeply entrenched within the Christian tradition and promoted different views of Christianity. So in the second half of the 20th century, Nihat Sami Banarlı, who was a disciple of the poet Yahya Kemal, so a conservative literary critic, Banarlı was. So he saw in novellas such as Chateaubriand's Atala and René, and more generally in Chateaubriand's Génie du Christianisme, a possible model for the more spiritual Turkish literary culture. So even though Banarlı upheld a religious nationalist, and by religious I mean Islamic nationalist view of culture and society, he nevertheless engaged with Christian literature. And in this article, in his article entitled Allahsız Sanat, so Godless Art, which he published in 1957, he pointed to Christian authors in whose works, I quote him, "the light of an openly faithful art burned brightly," end of quote. So he believed that Christian literature could be a model for the more spiritual literature in Turkey. Now, in the 20th century, the Bible too became a source of inspiration for a variety of authors, such as Halide Edip Adıvar. You see one of her works, Kenan Çobanları, so the shepherds of Canaan, or Sevim Burak and Yanık Saraylar, so burnt palaces. And indeed, I could cite many more. Now, it is very important not to reduce these developments to simply to cultural westernization, as perhaps sometimes it is done. Indeed, when we talk about about European literatures, we are ready to embrace the idea that Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan, Marceline Desbordes-Valmore's poem Les Roses de Saadi, or Federico García Lorca's Divan del Tamarit are the product of intellectual curiosity, aesthetic delight, and spiritual yearnings. So why should the same logic not apply when a 19th century Ottoman Turkish author writes a new version of Chateaubriand's Atala, or when poets from the İkinci Yeni, the second renewal movement, so it's a modernist movement of the second half of the 20th century, when these poets engage with biblical motifs, both from the Tanakh and from the Gospels. Perhaps there is a tendency to overemphasize geopolitics and socio-economics when engaging with the literatures and the cultures of Turkey and the Near East, and to forget a little that writers from Turkey too were above all persons with agency who were intellectually and spiritually curious. So what I wanted to say with this is that perhaps Avetaranian's concerns were a little unnecessary. Nevertheless, for scholars of Turkish literature in the late Ottoman Empire, Avetaranian's concerns are an invitation to question some of the dogmas that have determined our field, rather. The academic study of Turkish literature in and outside Turkey has, up to the 1990s, adopted has adopted an approach that retrospectively projected the understanding of a supposedly homogeneous nation state on the ethno-religiously and linguistically diverse literary world of Ottoman Turkey, ignoring or sometimes denying the culturally pluralistic dimension of the literary field. Now, increasingly scholars have been questioning these type of, I'm using it between inverted commas, nationalist approaches by rereading, among others, the testimonies of literary actors. So I'm going to give a couple of examples here. Now, in his remarkable memoirs entitled Matbuat Hatıralarım, so my memoirs of the publishing world, which was published in 1930 and 31, Ahmet İhsan Topgöz, a groundbreaking Muslim editor, records that he had occasionally contributed to the Armeno-Turkish periodical Cihan. That was a publication that was in Turkish, but in the Armenian alphabet. I quote him, "As I had learned the Armenian alphabet, I had seen a bi-weekly magazine that was written in the Armenian alphabet, but whose language was Turkish. Its narrative style copied European magazines. I liked the articles about technology, literature, and the economy, and for a long time, I too wrote articles for Cihan." End of quote. So we have an author, Turkish, of Muslim background, writing in Armeno-Turkish. Another example is Elia Carmona, the journalist and Judeo-Spanish novelist. In his memoirs too, he refers to intercommunal exchanges within the Ottoman Turkish literary field. I mean, his memoirs are extremely entertaining. They have title that is perhaps a little bit too long, so which goes Cómo nació Elia Carmona, cómo se engrandeció y cómo se hizo director del Juguetón. So it's in Ladino, in Judeo-Spanish. So, and if we had to translate this, it's how Elia Carmona was born, how he grew up, and how he became the director of El Juguetón, which was a satirical or humoristic magazine. So in his quest for inspiration for his romanzos, his novelas in Judeo-Spanish, Carmona regularly attended the plays of the Armenian theater director Mardiros Minakian, which were staged in Turkish. Moreover, Carmona had set up, with the financial support of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a small press within a larger printing house owned by the Greek printer Alexander Numismatides, which is yet further evidence that the literary world did not consist of ethno-religiously segregated sectors. Now, if we accept that for the intelligentsia, alphabets and languages were not necessarily barriers, then interesting new opportunities arise when thinking about the development of 19th century Turkish literature including the reception of Christian missionary literature. Now, for some of the readers who consumed the publications of Christian missionary societies, the proselytizing aims of the publishers had perhaps less importance than the pleasure provided by the literary nature of the books they were reading. A popular novel translated from French could be as much a source of enjoyment and edification as a book of the Hebrew Bible translated into the Turkish vernacular. Reminiscing on their reading habits, a Greco-Turkish reader from Cappadocia, whose written recollection is preserved at the archives of oral tradition at the Center for Asia Minor Studies in Athens, draws a revealing picture of this reality. I'm going to quote her. I also did not neglect to read the novel Le Comte de Monte Cristo, the novels Le Comte de Monte Cristo, Et Mekci Hatun, and I was also taught other books like Bios Agion, The Lives of Saints. Since I enjoyed reading them, I imprinted them and all the fine things that I read in my mind and made them my own. If only I could become like the heroes who demonstrated those virtues. I may have read the Proverbs of Solomon 5 times in 1886. I memorized most of them, and all my life they have protected me from the intoxication of youth and kept me on the straight and narrow. End of quote. Now, we see that this reader mentions side by side Alexandre Dumas and Xavier de Montépin, two popular French novelists, a hagiography, and the Proverbs of King Solomon. While the emphasis is clearly on the didactic nature of those works, there is little doubt that the pleasure provided by those texts must have been similar. The reader seems to consider Le Comte de Monte Cristo, which was really an Ottoman bestseller at the time. It had been translated into Greco-Turkish, so Karamanlı, into Armeno-Turkish and into Ottoman Turkish, as well as in other languages of the empire. And so he considers Le Comte de Monte Cristo, or she considers Le Comte de Monte Cristo, and the Greco-Turkish translation of Montépin's popular La Porteuse de Pain, another great bestseller in the Ottoman Turkish context. So he puts them in the same category as a biblical collection of proverbs and saying. Now, this is indicative of a crossing of boundaries between sacred and secular literatures, a crossing that is enabled by the translation of the biblical texts into the vernacular through Protestant missionary societies. So a dual process is taking place here, most probably equally unwanted by the missionaries. Sacred books are secularized by being read in the vernacular, and literary works are raised to the same status as biblical books. It is worthwhile remembering that at the very time missionaries from the United States and the United Kingdom were hoping to disseminate their brand of Christianity among the Christian and Jewish populations of Ottoman Turkey by printing and distributing biblical translations, back at home, some philosophers and scholars, such as Matthew Arnold, for instance, argued that the biblical God was mostly, I quote Arnold, a term of poetry and eloquence, a term thrown out, so to speak, at a not fully grasped object of the speaker's consciousness, a literary term, in short, end of quote. And that, again, Arnold speaking, I quote, the personage of the Christian heaven and their conversations were no more matter of fact than the personages of the Greek Olympus and their conversations. So this happens in parallel, end of quote. So for Arnold, the Bible was literature. Now, without being as radical as Arnold, the attitude of the above reader suggests that, completely independently from matters of faith, reading a sacred text, such as the Proverbs, attributed to King Solomon, could be a source of literary pleasure and was thus at least in the vernacular literature. Now, this is, of course, nothing new, also nothing new in the Anatolian Turkish context. Already in 1888, Joachim Valavanis, a Cappadocian scholar and educated, noted that the appearance of Karamanlı, so Greco-Turkish books in Asia Minor, including the religious publications, played a fundamental role in infusing a love of literature in a population that, in the past, had only felt disdain for it. Now, we have, of course, then a question. Were these translations of the Bible, for instance, were they literarily interesting I think the best thing is to look at perhaps at an example. So examples of translated biblical texts that might have led to literary and aesthetic pleasures are many. I'm just don't know if this is very readable. I was told there was too much text on my slide, and most of it is in Turkish, so I hope it's not too traumatizing. But we have here on what I believe is the left of my slide, we have a translation into Greco-Turkish, which I have transcribed into modern Turkish here, that was published in 1905. These are the opening lines of the Gospel of St. John. So I will quickly read it. İptidada idi kelam ve kelam Allah'ın katındaydı ve kelam Allah idi. Bu iptidada Allah'ın katındaydı. Her şey onun ile oldu ve hiçbir olmuş şey onsuz olmadı. Onda hayat var idi ve hayat Ademlerin ışığıydı. Ve ışık karanlıkta ziya verir idi ve karanlık onu anlamadı. So you have the translation from well the text from the King James Bible at the bottom of my slide. What is interesting here from when you know Turkish is that we have a rather minimalist wording, which is partly explicable with the translator's reliance on words with Turkic roots. So even though it's Greco-Turkish, it's words with Turkic roots and not so much words of Persian and Arabic origin that you would expect in Ottoman Turkish. And this makes this translation much more attractive in a way for the modern, for the contemporary, for the reader today than the 1886 Ottoman Turkish version co-published by the American and British Bible Societies. I'm not going to read it again, but you see, especially if you look at verse 3, which in the Greco-Turkish version is only 19 syllables long. In the Ottoman Turkish version, we have 34 syllables. It's really much longer. We have a much greater impact of words of Turkish and not of Turkish, of Arabic and Persian origin. The Greco-Turkish version, I mean, we have all these alliterations in O, which helps the reading and the reciting of the text, which we do not have in the Ottoman Turkish version. So I think this is actually quite interesting because these texts, the Greco-Turkish text is being published at a time there were huge debates within the Ottoman literary world about the need to simplify the literary language, to bring it closer to the language that was actually spoken by the people. This is something we encounter really in Greco-Turkish translations, also in Armeno-Turkish translations. The question that we need to ask ourselves is up to what point such translations might have been inspiring for Ottoman Turkish writers looking for a new literary language. Now, in Ottoman Turkey, the 19th century was an era of great literary upheavals. Breaking with the tradition of divan poetry, Ottoman Turkish authors were appropriating new literary genres such as the novel, the short story, drama, and they were in search of a new literary language. The growth of the press in Ottoman Turkish too required the development of a language which was intelligible to a broader audience. Could translations made with religious aims in the post-Tanzimat period, the Tanzimat took place in 1839, have contributed to the development of the Turkish literary language? Now, the question regarding this question is not as far-fetched as it seems. The language of Bible translations in Armeno-Turkish and Karamanlı was compact and avoiding those very Persian grammatical constructions and learned Arabic and Persian vocabulary of contemporary Ottoman Turkish texts that were being criticized. So perhaps these translations could have been of interest to reformist writers, those writers who wanted to bridge the gap between the spoken language and the language of Ottoman prose and poetry, and who worked towards the simplification and democratization of the language of literature. It is a question, I'm not able to answer it, but I have sufficient evidence of Ottoman Turkish authors reading texts in Greco-Turkish, reading texts in Armeno-Turkish, that allow me to think that perhaps they might very well have read the Bible in translation as well, in Greco-Turkish and other missionary texts, and been inspired by the language. It's a question, not I'm not answering it. But it's a research question, let's say. So Armeno-Turkish and Greco-Turkish translations of literary and biblical texts provided examples of prose in a language close to that spoken by the people. Similarly, the translation of a proto-novel like the Pilgrim's Progress was attractive for writers who themselves were exploring ways of moving beyond traditional narratives, such as the hikaye in the context of let's say folk literature, or the mesnevi in the context of classical Sufi literature. So it's like while looking to move towards something that could be called the realist novel. And with regard to realism, the translation of a text such as Hesba Stretton's Jessica's First Prayer and its humane yet realist depiction of poverty might also have attracted the attention of authors in search of ways to explore social concerns in fiction in late 19th century Ottoman Istanbul. The fact that alphabet differences were not necessarily impediments to the diffusion of literature leads us to ask those questions. But beside the question of the literary impact of missionary translations, there is also a question regarding the role of texts with a Christian message that were translated not for missionary, but for literary reasons by Ottoman Turkish writers of Muslim heritage. And I will just dwell on one example now, which is the translation of Silvio Pellico's Le mie prigioni, which it was originally published in 1832 in Italian, but translated in 1874, so it's complicated publication history, translated in 1874 into Ottoman Turkish, and the publication of the first part of Le mie prigioni, my prisons, led to the publication of a strong rebuttal entitled in Turkish, in Franco-Turkish, let's say, Mes prisons, moi, that's why I get confused when I have to pronounce Turkish and then French, my accent is all over the place. Mes prisons, moi, hezenamese, so a criticism of Mes prisons, which was published by the leading young Ottoman writer and activist Namık Kemal. Now that the translator was Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem, whom you see on a stamp there on the screen, who was a disciple of Namık Kemal, at least in matters of literary innovation, and at the time was still at the outset of a remarkable literary career, is indicative of the significance of Kemal's reaction that combined for the first time in an Ottoman Turkish context a discussion of prison literature, and prison literature was to become and remains, unfortunately, something very important in a Turkish literary context. So it combines, for the first time, a discussion of prison literature, questions of aesthetics, and of political engagement. Now, it must be noted here, however, that Ekrem, the translator, chose not to respond to Kemal, though in his later years, Ekrem was known not to dislike the odd bit of controversy. Now, it must be said here that his decision to translate Pellico might seem a rather incongruous decision, even if the Italian writer's prison memoirs had attracted much attention all over Europe. Reformist Ottoman Turkish literati were, up to a point, keen followers of literary fashions in France. And it must be said here, I haven't said this before, Ekrem translated Pellico's text not from the original Italian, but from one of the many French translations. So Pellico was known in Ottoman Turkey as a leading member of the Carbonari revolutionary society that had been ruthlessly repressed by the authorities of the Habsburg Empire. What was perhaps less known in Istanbul was that his prison memoirs had disappointed revolutionaries all over the continent. Why was that? Well, many were dismayed by Pellico's religious conversion to a form of dolorist Catholicism. Now, the fact that he forgave his oppressors and then what appeared to be his submissiveness to the state. Now, in France, the translation into French of Les Mille Prigioni, and one scholar, Jean-Claude Villemont, has found out that the book was re-edited 150 times between 1833 and 1914. So it's quite a bestseller, but it was a bestseller in the above all in the milieus close to Roman Catholic conservatism in France. Interestingly, Ekrem, in his youth, seems to have been shown a particular fondness for narratives with a distinct Catholic lilt, though it must be said that he never elaborated much on the reasons that led him to translate certain texts. 2 years before he published his translation of Méprisons, he had published a translation of another romantic favorite, namely Chateaubriand's Atala, a novella that, notwithstanding its literary qualities, was promoted not the least by its author as a work of Christian edification. And interestingly, Ekrem even wrote a theatre play based on Atala. Now, the extent to which the Christian subtext of those two literary texts, of those two literary works influenced Ekrem's desire to translate them is open to discussion, as he gives, as I said, little information about his motives and motivation. Now, someone who has an opinion on this is Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. You may be familiar with Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar as a novelist. Some of his novels have been translated into English, but he is also a very important literary historian who wrote a milestone history of 19th century Turkish literature. And he argues that Ekrem's decision to translate Pellico's work about his prison experiences was a way of expressing his protest at Namık Kemal's banishment and imprisonment to Famagusta in Cyprus. Now we'll look at this. Now, Kemal's arrest, so Kemal, his future critic, arrest had happened in the aftermath of the popular success of his play Vatan Yahut Silistre, The Motherland or Silistre, in 1872, that had been warmly received by the patrons of Güllü Agop, another Armenian, the patron of Güllü Agop's theatre in Gedikpaşa in Istanbul. The audience's patriotic slogans, "Long live the motherland, long live Kemal," spooked the government of Sultan Abdulaziz, not the least as Kemal was known to associate it with people suspected of plotting to overthrow the despotic ruler. Now, Ekrem very much saw Kemal as a mentor, and he always paid heed to his words, even when they were unduly harsh, and Kemal was known for rarely mincing them. So I think Tanpınar's hypothesis might well have been close to the truth, even though Ekrem though he was very daring in literary matters, was less so in political. Now, let us look at and get back actually to our topic of contacts between religions and etc. So Kemal expressed his dislike of Ekrem's vocabulary and language. So you see the language question is again fundamental here. At times he considered it too profane, so too popular. At other times he considered it too passionate. Aware that Ekrem had translated and serialized the initial part of Pellico's text years earlier, at a time when he was still a rather unexperienced writer, Kemal was emphatic in his disapproval. And I should have, what I have done, I've put you the original Turkish here in transliteration. I'll read the translation to you. So this is Kemal criticizing Ekrem. Stylistically, the translation is inferior to the style of your current works. In fact, when you translated this chapter into our language, not only the power of your pen, but even the literature of the nation had not reached the level of perfection seen in your new works or in your current works. At least you could have edited your work. End of quote. Now, Kemal had a point here. Now, in any case, it mattered to him to remain in the position of the teacher, the more so as Ekrem did not mind being seen as a disciple, Kemal's disciple, which was a badge of honor in literary circles. It appears that Ekrem was far from impermeable to Kemal's criticism. Now, in a letter, Kemal criticized Ekrem for actually doing translations, and we found that he should not lose his time with translations. And Ekrem, interestingly, after receiving that letter in 1874, stopped publishing translations in book form. He published some of them in magazines and so, but not in book form. But as noted above, the main bulk of Kemal's criticism was not directed at Ekrem, but rather at Silvio Pellico. Now, Kemal contrasts his own experiences in jail, and he had quite a few in jail and exile, with those of Pellico's. So he belittles the Italian writer's circumstances and, up to a point, uses them as an opportunity for self-aggrandizing statements. So, for instance, while Pellico noted his inability to sleep during his first night in jail, Kemal stressed that he had never slept so well when he was for the first time in jail. But what really disturbed Kemal was the romantic self-pity of Pellico's narrative. Now, from the outset, he declares his disdain for Pellico's crying and the many tears he sheds throughout his memoirs. They were, according to the Ottoman poet, unworthy of a true patriot who should embrace his trials and tribulations for love of the motherland. So the tears of the martyrs of freedom are like impure blood running from their wounds, Kemal writes. Those whose heart has been wounded with the spiritual concept of the love of the motherland do not shed tears from their eyes, but they shed flames. End of quote. Now, beside Kemal's arguably legitimate concerns about Pellico's political change of heart, there is no doubt that he did not take sufficiently the conventions and cliches of romantic literature, and especially of the dolorous Catholic discourse, into consideration when discussing Pellico's narrative. And Kemal took him perhaps a little too literally. Pellico's tearful accepting of suffering and his all-embracing compassion might have been as much a literary topoi as they were autobiographical statements, statements of his newfound faith. Now, in fact, Kemal's critique is revealing not only of Kemal's passionate patriotism, but also of his antipathy towards Catholic Christianity, or at least aspects of his theology. This prevented him from producing a more emphatic reading of Pellico's memoirs. Kemal has little sympathy for Pellico's conversion, not because he considered it in concurrence with the revolutionary aspirations, but because the discovery of faith when faced with hardship was suspicious in his eyes. So it's the first quote on the top. But the behavior of those who do not think of religious matters in times of peace and felicity, yet when faced with calamity say, oh, there was something they called religion, let me try it out, perhaps it will save me, and thus start to practice religion, is an attitude no less ignominious than unbelief. End of quote. So Kemal's own approach leaves little time for atonement and redemption, as he questions the sincerity of the convert. But the possibility of redemption is not the only Christian belief that Kemal's questions. The doctrine of the Trinity leads him to show more understanding for one of Pellico's atheist pan-friends, going by the name of Julian, in reference to the Roman emperor who rejected Christianity, than for Pellico. I quote, it's the second quote on the slide, I cannot blame Julian's unbelief that much. I cannot blame Julian's unbelief that much. The Christian religion that is built upon the Trinity is a religion that cannot be espoused by any wise man. End of quote. So redemption is not an idea that Kemal identifies as specifically Christian in his criticism, but rather he associates Pellico's belief in it in the possibility of redemption as one of the many personal failings of the author. However, what we have here is that Kemal's disapproval turns out to be directed at what is a very fundamental Christian value. And he sees this as a personal weakness and lack of patriotism, which he sees then in conflict with religion, or with at least with Catholicism here. And then on top of these ideological difference, he grafts Ekrem's linguistic failings. Hence, his long attack is also rooted in his concern about the possibly nefarious influence that the text could have in an Ottoman Turkish context. And I'm aware I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump over this quote and jump to my conclusion. Now, regarding the combination of arguments regarding the aesthetics of the literary work, the language, the form, and ideological disagreements regarding religions, or the religion stance, yes, and this ideological disagreement is in a way with things that could be considered Christian topoi. So this really set the frame for later literary controversies combining politics and aesthetics, when often literary failings ended up being seen as symptoms of political failings more generally. Now, what we can see from this example, which is a strong reaction against the Christian message, that this negative approach can also lead to developments in the literary sphere. But let me conclude with an idea, albeit a controversial one. Perhaps the German concept of Kulturchristentum, which one could unsatisfactorily translate as cultural Christianity, may be a useful concept in this discussion. Now, in a German context, Kulturchristentum is referred to as a post-Enlightenment development. It is a concept that is used to categorize cultural products that engage with Christian culture, and more specifically the Christian imaginaire. Importantly, as noted by Wilhelm Gößmann in his study that you see there, Cultural Christianity, Religion and Literature in Intellectual History, those who participate in the production of cultural Christianity in its broadest sense are those persons who are more or less disconnected from any church, who are even agnostics, but and he continues arguing that cultural Christianity is a modern concept which could be used to describe secularizing processes in a culture determined by Christianity. Now, what I am wondering is that if there is not room to redefine the term so as to include authors and artists hailing not from a culture determined by Christianity, but who nevertheless engage through their translations and their creative works with biblical references and Christian literature, and thus participate in what could be considered a plural interpretation of cultural Christianity. So now what we have on the one hand a question for people who work on cultural Christianity here, but for literary scholars like me who work on Turkish literature, this is really also an invitation to engage perhaps with the type of texts like missionary translations that we would not necessarily look at and start asking those questions. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mignon, for introducing us to a whole cultural world there with, of course, literature and language and alphabet, translation and religion as well. Now, I think if we can ask you to stop sharing your screen, please, that will enable everybody to appear on screen. And part of the purpose of that is to make it a little bit easier for me as chair to invite people to ask your questions. The easiest way to do this is to go on to the reactions button at the bottom and click on the raise hand button. That will bring you to the top of the queue. So I see one already, which is great. The alternative is just to wave, but that's dependent on catching my eye, so is a little bit more risky. Just to get the discussion going, though, I am going to ask the first question, if I may, and to take you back, Professor Mignon, to John Bunyan in particular, and the Pilgrim's Progress, because I know on the basis of Christopher Hill's work on that, this was a work that was hugely influential in China, not just in the domain of religion and spirituality, but in terms of its political implications as well, even to the extent Hill suggests of revolutions being caused in China, partly on the basis of what most Christians today would think of as a kind of spiritual classic. But there is a radical political dimension to it as well. Is there any parallel to that, I wonder, in terms of the impact of Pilgrim's Progress in Turkish literatures?
I haven't come across it, but it's an excellent question. I mean, when it comes to its literary impact, it's interesting to see if you look at a history of Turkish literature in the 19th century and at the list of translations that were published, etc., you will never see the Pilgrim's Progress. For some reason, because it was published by missionary presses, or because it was published in the beginning in Greco-Turkish and in Armeno-Turkish, but in the early 20th century, among others, because of Avetaranyan, but also someone called Mustafa Necati. There were Ottoman Turkish translations available as well. There is somehow a taboo around this text. So what I am and other texts published by the missionaries, the Christian missionaries. So what I am doing here is really only speculating, because I know that some leading authors in the 19th century, such as Ahmet Mithat Efendi, Halit Ziya Uşaklıgil, in their memoirs, in their articles, refer occasionally to Turkish in other scripts, in the Armenian, in the Greek scripts, and mention that they've been reading texts or sometimes even writing texts with those alphabets. I suspect that they must have read those texts as well, because when we look at the historians of English literature in Turkey today, all of them refer to Bunyan, to the Pilgrim's Progress, to the importance of the work as a proto-novel, or as the ancestor of the novel, etc. So there is certainly among literary scholars agreement on the importance of the work. So I do suspect that a few decades earlier, people would have known it as well and will have read it, but there is of course a taboo, because they are not supposed to read it, because it comes from missionary presses. But we all know that literarily active people do a lot of banned things, and that's often where good literature comes from.
Bunyan as samizdat literature, as it were, is a rather intriguing prospect. Thank you to you all for joining the group this evening for some very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Can I ask just finally us to express our thanks to Professor Mignon for a very stimulating talk, either through the traditional clap or through the virtual clap on the reactions. Thank you very much for your time and all the work you've put into the presentation. Set all of us, I'm sure, thinking new thoughts in a very creative way, and best wishes for all your work in the context of Oxford, both Thames and St Antony's, of course, as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Thea.